The night Eliza Calloway arrived in Dust Creek, Texas, the town smelled like gun smoke and broken promises, and every man who watched her step off that stagecoach knew she did not belong there. It was the spring of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle was still a place where the land decided everything: who survived, who thrived, and who got swallowed whole by the red dust and the relentless, burning sky. Dust Creek had grown up around a water source and a cattle route, the kind of town that appeared on maps with the faint optimism of new settlement and disappeared from memory just as easily. There was a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Copper Spur, a telegraph office that still smelled of fresh lumber, and a church that held services only when the traveling preacher came through, which was not often enough for the souls that needed saving in Dust Creek. Eliza Calloway was 22 years old and carried herself with the particular kind of quiet dignity that belonged to women who had survived things they never spoke of aloud. She had dark auburn hair that caught the last light of the afternoon sun and turned it into something almost copper, and her eyes were a shade of green so deep they looked almost like the river grass that grew along the creek banks in early summer. She wore a traveling dress the color of storm clouds, practical and modest, and she carried a single leather trunk and a hat box that had seen better days. She had come from St. Louis, Missouri, on the recommendation of the newly formed Dust Creek School Board, which had advertised in 3 eastern newspapers for a qualified schoolteacher willing to relocate to the Texas frontier. Eliza had answered that advertisement with a letter written in careful, precise handwriting, and a list of qualifications that included 2 years of teaching at a girls' academy in Missouri. What she had not included in her letter, because it was not the board's business, was that she was running away from something, though she told herself she was running towards something instead. What she was running from was a man named Gerald Whitmore, a banker's son who had made her certain promises in parlors that smelled of beeswax candles, and then decided, when the promises became inconvenient, that he had never quite made them at all. She was not heartbroken in the way that breaks a person. She was heartbroken in the way that clarifies things, that strips the romantic fog from your eyes and lets you see the shape of your own life with terrible, useful clarity. So she had packed her trunk, answered the advertisement, and arrived in Dust Creek, Texas, with the dust of 3 days of travel still on her skin and the fierce, private resolve of a woman who intends to build something real. The stagecoach driver set her trunk on the boardwalk in front of the general store and tipped his hat and drove on, and Eliza stood alone on that main street, with the late afternoon sun hammering the earth and the town looking at her from behind its windows and saloon doors with the slow, assessing curiosity of a place that did not often see women arrive alone. It was Mabel Hutchins, the wife of the general store owner, who came out first. She was a broad, warm-hearted woman in her 40s with flour on her apron, and the kind of welcome in her face that required no social preamble. She took one look at Eliza standing there in her storm-colored dress with her chin lifted just slightly higher than it needed to be, and she understood everything important about her in approximately 30 seconds. "You must be the new schoolteacher," Mabel said, extending both hands as if she intended to catch Eliza if she fell. "I am Mabel Hutchins. We have been waiting on you something fierce. The children in this town have been running absolutely wild since old Mr. Perkins took his rheumatism back to Kansas City." Eliza shook her hands and felt something in her chest ease slightly. "Eliza Calloway, I am very glad to be here, Mrs. Hutchins." "You will stay with us until the schoolhouse residence is ready," Mabel said, in the tone of someone who has already decided this and considers the conversation concluded. "Harold has been meaning to fix the plumbing situation in the schoolmaster's quarters for 3 weeks now, and I have been telling him that teachers deserve to arrive to a house that has working plumbing, and he has finally listened. Another 2 days and it will be ready." "That is very kind," Eliza said, and meant it. She did not see Cole Whitfield that first evening. She saw him the next morning, just after dawn, from the window of the room Mabel had given her above the general store. He was crossing the main street leading a buckskin horse toward the livery, and there was something about the way he moved that made her pause with her hairbrush halfway through her hair and watch without quite deciding to. He was tall, not in the exaggerated, theatrical way that men sometimes carried themselves in cities to seem impressive, but in the natural, easy way of someone whose body had been shaped by years of outdoor labor. He wore working clothes, dusty from the trail, with a battered hat pushed back on his head the way men wore hats when they were not thinking about the impression they made. His face, even from this distance, was the kind that told a story, weathered and honest, with the sort of quiet in it that did not read as emptiness but as depth. She did not know his name yet. She did not know anything about him, but she noticed him the way you sometimes notice a particular tree on a stretch of open landscape, not because it demands your attention, but because your eye finds it and returns to it without being asked. She finished her hair and did not think about him again. Or told herself she didn't. Cole Whitfield had been working the range around Dust Creek for 4 years, since he was 24, and had ridden up from the south with $2, a good horse, and the kind of reputation that came from being good at hard things without making much noise about it. He worked for the Hargrove cattle operation, which was the largest outfit in the county, and he had worked his way from a hired hand's bunk to the position of trail boss, which meant he was responsible for moving Hargrove cattle from the grazing ranges to the railhead at Amarillo twice a year, and managing a crew of 8 men in between. He was a private man, not because he was unfriendly, but because he had learned early that words cost something and ought to be spent carefully. The men who worked under him respected him because he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself, and he never lied to them about the difficulty of a situation, and he had the particular gift of making hard decisions without flinching and living with the consequences without complaint. He was not a man who thought much about his personal loneliness. He knew it was there the way you know a tooth is going to hurt before it does, an awareness that lives in the background and occasionally surfaces at odd moments, usually at night when the prairie was dark and enormous and utterly indifferent to the fact of his existence. He had heard about the new schoolteacher before he saw her. Dust Creek was small enough that news traveled the length of it before the subject of the news had time to unpack their bags. Mabel Hutchins told half the town within the first hour, and the other half heard it from them. Cole had been in the livery getting his horse settled from a 3-day ride when Tom Briggs, who worked at the telegraph office, leaned against the stall doorframe and said, "New schoolteacher came in on the afternoon coach, Eastern girl, pretty as a sunrise, according to Frank Dutton who helped with her trunk." Cole had made a noncommittal sound and gone back to tending his horse and had not thought much more about it. He first spoke to her on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after her arrival. She was standing outside the general store with a list in her hand, and a look on her face that suggested she was having a private argument with herself about something. He was coming out of the store with a tin of coffee and nearly walked into her because she had stopped abruptly on the boardwalk to consult her list. "Pardon me," he said, stepping aside. She looked up, and the green of her eyes in the morning light was startling enough that he held himself very still for a half-second, the way you hold yourself still when you have nearly startled something that might bolt. "No, I beg your pardon," she said, folding her list. "I stopped without thinking. I am sorry." "No harm done," he said. There was a beat of silence, not uncomfortable exactly, just new. "You are the school teacher," he said, not as a question. "I am Eliza Calloway." She extended her hand the way a professional did, direct and deliberate. He shook it. His hand was calloused and warm and careful with its strength. "Cole Whitfield. I work the Hargrove Range." "A cowboy," she said, and it was not a dismissive word the way she said it, just a naming of a thing. "A trail boss," he said, though without ego. "More or less the same thing, just more paperwork." She laughed. It was a small, real laugh, the kind that arrives before you have decided whether the thing is worth laughing at, which is the only kind that counts. He tipped his hat and she nodded, and they went their separate ways, and that was the whole of it, and neither of them made more of it than it was. But Mabel Hutchins, who had been watching from behind a bolt of calico in the store window, made considerably more of it than it was, and told her husband Harold that evening that she had a feeling. And Harold said, "Mabel, you always have a feeling," and Mabel said, "And I am usually right," which was, Harold had to admit, accurate. The schoolhouse was a sturdy single-room building at the east end of Main Street, with 4 windows and a pot-bellied stove, and a row of hooks along the back wall for the children's coats. The residence attached to it was small but clean, with a wooden floor and a proper cast-iron cook-stove, and a window that looked out over the open prairie to the east, where the land stretched away in long, sweeping waves of grass that turned gold in the afternoon light. Eliza loved that window immediately and without reservation. She had grown up in St. Louis in a house where every window looked at another building, and the idea that a window could open onto infinity was deeply and specifically wonderful to her. She spent 2 days setting the schoolhouse to rights, organizing the reader books and the arithmetic slates, and writing the day's lessons on the broad blackboard she had had Harold Hutchins hang on the east wall. She had 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she met them on that first Monday morning in April when they came in from the dust with their faces scrubbed to various degrees of cleanliness, and their eyes full of the particular wariness that children bring to new authority figures until proven otherwise. She had, within the first week, won them completely. Not with softness, but with fairness, and with the particular gift she had of making learning feel like it belonged to the child rather than being handed down from above. She taught them their letters and their numbers and their history, and she read to them on Friday afternoons from whatever book she happened to be working through herself, and the classroom became, very quickly, a place where children wanted to be. The town noticed this and approved of her in the cautious, measuring way that frontier communities approved of things, gradually, and with the understanding that approval could be revised. Cole noticed it because he rode past the schoolhouse twice a week on his way to and from the northern pastures, and he could hear, sometimes, the rise and fall of her voice through the open windows, and once he heard a wave of children's laughter break through the afternoon quiet, and something about the sound of it made him hold his horse a beat longer than necessary before riding on. It was the end of April when the first real conversation happened. Not the brief courtesy of the boardwalk, but the kind of conversation that goes somewhere. He had stopped at the creek that ran along the southern edge of town to let his horse drink, and she was there too, sitting on a flat rock at the water's edge with her boots off and her feet in the water, and a book open in her lap, looking for all the world as if she had decided that the world could wait while she read. She did not notice him at first, and he watched her for a moment, not intrusively, just in the way you observe something that has the quality of being entirely itself, unhurried and genuine. Then his horse shook its bridle and she looked up. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, not startled, just acknowledging. "Miss Calloway, I did not mean to interrupt." "You are not interrupting," she said. "I was just reading, and reading is always improved by company, I find, unless the company talks too much." He smiled at that, a slow, real smile that did not arrive in a hurry. "I have been told I am short on words." "That is a quality I have come to appreciate deeply," she said, with a dryness that suggested she had her reasons. He tied his horse to a willow branch and came to sit on a nearby rock at a respectful distance, and they sat for a while in the quiet of the creek, which is a special kind of quiet full of small, living sounds, the water moving over the stones, the cottonwoods talking to each other in the breeze, a meadowlark trying out its repertoire somewhere downstream. "What are you reading?" he asked. She showed him the cover. It was a collection of natural history essays by John Muir, the kind of writing that tried to understand wild places by paying very close attention to them. "Is it good?" he asked. "It is extraordinary," she said simply. "He writes about the Sierra Nevada mountains the way I imagine a painter paints what he loves, not trying to make it impressive, just trying to be honest about it." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I have never been to mountains," he said. "I have lived in flat country my whole life." "Do you mind it, the flatness?" He thought about it, which she noticed. He did not answer questions reflexively. He turned them over first. "No," he said eventually. "I think flat country asks something of you. There is nowhere to hide from the sky. It is always there, the whole of it. Some people find that uncomfortable." He paused. "I find it honest." She looked at him steadily. "That is a beautiful way to think about it." He looked away, not from embarrassment exactly, but from the mild unease of a man who has said something more personal than he intended. "I am not generally a man for pretty words." "No," she agreed, "but you said a true thing, and true things are prettier than pretty words in my experience." He looked back at her then, and their eyes held for just a second longer than ordinary conversation requires, and then they both looked at the water. They talked for another half-hour, about Dusk Creek and how it was growing, about the cattle business and the shift toward the northern ranges as the southern water dried up in drought years, about St. Louis and what it was like to grow up in a city, which he found genuinely curious, about teaching and whether she liked it, and she said she loved it with the directness of someone who has arrived at certainty through evidence. He rode away with the particular feeling of a man who has been more awake during an hour of conversation than he has been in a long time, and he rode with it all the way back to the Hargrove bunkhouse, and did not examine it too carefully, because careful examination of things you are not ready for has a way of frightening them off. May came in warm and steady, the kind of Texas spring that is so perfect it almost seems apologetic about the summers it is preambling. The prairie around Dusk Creek went green, and then gold, and the wildflowers did their brief, reckless thing along the creek banks and the roadsides, and the town had its Saturday social in the churchyard. The traveling preacher had come through the week prior and left the building in a state of unusual spiritual readiness, which Mabel Hutchins interpreted as a sign that a social was warranted. There was fiddle music and a long table covered in food that every woman in town had contributed to, and the children ran in the long evening light like small, joyful animals, and the men stood with their drinks and talked cattle prices and weather and the coming summer, which promised to be a hard one. Cole came because Hargrove had made it clear he valued his foreman being present at town events, and because he had not, in 4 years, found a good reason to avoid them. He stood at the edge of the gathering with a cup of cider and was talking to Jim Pierce, who ran the livery, when he saw Eliza across the churchyard. She was talking to the Hutchins family and laughing at something Harold had said, and she was wearing a dress the color of meadow sage, and her hair was down in a way he had not seen it before, loose and a little wild from a day of working in the school garden she had started on the south side of the building. She looked like she belonged there. Not in Dusk Creek specifically, but in the moment like someone who is genuinely, unguardedly present in their own life. He did not approach her. He was aware of the town's attention in the particular way that private people are aware of being observed, and he was not ready to give Dusk Creek something to talk about, mostly because he did not yet know what there was to talk about. But when the fiddles started, and the dancing began in the flattened grass of the churchyard, and when it happened that the natural circulation of the crowd brought them both to the same edge of the gathering at the same moment, it seemed more artificial to not speak than to speak. "Miss Calloway," he said, "Mr. Whitfield." She had a small smile that was doing something complicated. "Are you dancing?" "I'm standing near the dancing," he said, "which is as close as I generally get. That is a considerable waste of a fiddle player's talent. I have been told I'm a trial to watch on a dance floor," he said. She tilted her head. "Who told you that?" "My mother, when I was 16. I have taken it as gospel since." She laughed. 16-year-old boys are universally dreadful at dancing. It does not necessarily follow into adulthood. You have scientific evidence for this claim. 23 students of varying coordination, she said. The ones who were dreadful at 6 tend to improve considerably by 14. There is hope for everyone. He looked at her for a moment with the quiet, direct attention that was characteristic of him. "Will you dance with me, Miss Calloway?" as an experiment in the educational value of second chances. It was the longest sentence he had said to her yet, and she recognized that he had reached for it deliberately, and the recognition of that delicate reaching was more moving than she had expected. "I will," she said. He was not, as it turned out, a natural dancer, but he was honest about it in the same way he was honest about most things. He did not pretend to be better than he was. He just committed fully to what he was attempting, and the result was something charming in its earnestness. She laughed twice at minor disasters of coordination, and he laughed once, which surprised them both, and by the end of the dance she was flushed and bright-eyed, and he was holding her hand a moment longer than the dance required before he remembered to let it go. "You were right," he said. "Second chances." "I usually am," she said, and there was something different in her voice now, softer at the edges, like a door that has been unlatched without yet being opened. He got her a cup of cider and they stood together watching the dancing for a while, and the town watched them watching the dancing, and Mabel Hutchins pressed her husband's arm and said something quietly that made him sigh with amiable resignation. It was June before Cole acknowledged, to himself, what was happening to him. He was not a man who fell carelessly or quickly. He had, in 4 years in Dust Creek, had a brief, careful relationship with a widow in the next county that had ended mutually and without damage to either party, and before that nothing that amounted to more than the ordinary human need for company that announces itself and then retreats. But this was something different in quality, in texture. In the particular way it occupied the parts of his mind that he could not consciously govern. He thought about her when he was riding, not deliberately, not with the self-indulgent construction of daydreams, but in the way that something truly present in you surfaces without being summoned. He thought about things she had said and the way she had said them. He thought about her hands when she was gesturing her way through an explanation, which she did with the eloquence of someone who had spent years making abstract things concrete for children. He thought about her laugh, which was always earned. He was a man who worked with animals and land and weather, and all of those things had taught him to be honest about what was real and what was wishful thinking, because confusing those two things in his line of work could get a man or his crew killed. He applied the same brutal honesty to his own interior landscape, which was how he arrived at the conclusion, sitting on a fence rail at the edge of the Hargrove pasture on a hot June afternoon, that he was falling in love with Eliza Calloway. He sat with this knowledge for a while, the way you sit with a fire you have just built, watching it establish itself, making sure it is real and not going to go out. Then he got down from the fence rail and got back to work, because there was nothing to be done about it today, and there was always work to be done. What he did not know was that 3 weeks earlier, Eliza had written a letter to her friend Clara Hennessy in St. Louis, and in that letter she had described, with more detail than she intended and then did not cross out because she had decided to be honest, at least in letters, a trail boss with a quiet face and economical words who had made her laugh at a Saturday social, and whose hands had held hers for exactly 1 beat too long after a dance, and who seemed to her like someone who had given considerable thought to the question of how to live well, and had arrived at some conclusions. Clara had written back, "Eliza and Calloway, I know that tone and I know what it means, and I am not sorry to hear it." Eliza had read this letter twice and then put it in the drawer of her night table and gone about her business with the focused, practical energy of a woman who has decided to be sensible about something. The trouble was that sensible had its limits. The summer deepened and hardened into the full Texas heat, and the schoolroom closed for the season, and the children scattered back to their families' farms and ranches, and Eliza found herself with days that had less structure and more space in them, which was a condition she had always managed well in St. Louis, by filling it with books and visits, and the organized industry of a woman who knew how to keep herself occupied. Here, the space felt different. The prairie was always there through her east window, enormous and golden and breathing, and the heat had a quality of intensity that felt like the land was paying attention. She planted more in the school garden. She helped Mabel in the general store on the mornings when Mabel's daughter was ill. She organized a reading circle for the women in town who met on Thursday evenings at the church, and she chose books that had enough substance to generate real conversation, which made her popular with some and mildly alarming to others. And she and Cole Whitfield had fallen into something that neither of them had named, but both of them knew the shape of. It had happened gradually and then all at once, the way these things do. The creek conversations had continued, whenever the heat of the day allowed it and their separate schedules allowed it, which was more often than coincidence could account for, and both of them knew it. He had started staying longer. She had started bringing 2 cups of tea in a small basket along with her book, and had offered him one without comment the first time, and he had taken it without comment. And the offering and the accepting had said a great deal more than either of them was prepared to say with words. He told her about his childhood, in pieces, over several conversations. The family farm in Hill County that had gone under after 3 years of drought and his father's death. The years he had spent drifting, taking work where he found it, learning the cattle trade from a series of men who were variably excellent and terrible teachers. The arrival in Dust Creek and the particular sense of recognition he had felt for this particular stretch of country, as if the land had been waiting for someone stubborn enough to pay it the kind of attention it deserved. She told him about St. Louis and her teaching and her family, who were decent people with conventional aspirations for their daughter that had not quite matched the shape of her own aspirations. She did not tell him about Gerald Whitmore, not because she was hiding it, but because it felt like a thing from a different life, a story that had belonged to someone who was still learning what she was worth. They had their first argument on a Wednesday in July, which was a remarkable milestone in any relationship, and in theirs constituted a significant expansion of intimacy. It was about water rights, of all things, which in Texas in 1878 was not a trivial matter. The Hargrove operation had diverted a section of the creek to the north pastures, and 2 of the smaller farms south of town were suffering for it. Cole had not made the decision, it had been Hargrove's call, but he had implemented it, which in Eliza's estimation made him responsible for it. They had been walking along the creek in the early evening, which had become their habit on the evenings when neither of them had competing obligations, and she had mentioned it because she had heard about it from one of the farm families whose child was in her classroom, and she was not the kind of woman who heard about an injustice and declined to mention it to the person who could do something about it. He had been quiet for a long moment. "I know it," he said finally. "Then why did you do it?" "Because Hargrove owns the water rights and he made the decision and I work for Hargrove," he said, and there was something uncomfortable in his voice that she recognized as the sound of a man who has already had this argument with himself and lost. "You are the trail boss," she said. "You have influence." "I have influence over the cattle operation," he said, "not over his property decisions." "They are not property decisions, they are people decisions," she said, and her voice had the particular clarity of someone who has thought about something hard and arrived at a position they will hold. "Those children are in my classroom and they are wearing shoes with holes in them because their fathers cannot bring crops to market on a dry field." He stopped walking. She stopped too, and they looked at each other, and it was the first time she had seen something heated in his face, not anger at her. She understood immediately, but at the situation and at himself for being part of it. "I know," he said again. "I am going to talk to Hargrove." "I am glad," she said. And then, because she was fair, she added, "I know it is not simple, I know you have obligations, but so do the people downstream." "Yes," he said quietly, "they do." He did talk to Hargrove the following morning. The conversation was not easy and Hargrove was not pleased, but Cole had a quality of quiet, immovable conviction that made people take him seriously even when they were irritated by him. and the result was a partial restoration of the creek flow that was not everything those southern farms needed, but was considerably better than nothing. He did not tell Eliza about this immediately. He told her a week later, in passing, in the plain way that he reported practical facts. She looked at him for a moment with something in her eyes that was more than gratitude, something that recognized the particular quality of a man who does the right thing quietly and without requiring an audience. "Thank you," she said. "I was not going to sleep well otherwise," he said, which was, she thought, one of the most honest things she had ever heard a person say about why they did something good. It was late July when he brought her wildflowers for the first time, which was not something Cole Whitfield had ever done for anyone, and he was aware, as he tied the bunch of prairie clover and black-eyed Susans together with a piece of twine, that he was crossing a line of some kind. Not an inappropriate line, but a line nonetheless. The line between a man who enjoys a woman's company and a man who has decided to let that fact become visible. He left them on the front step of the schoolhouse residence on a morning when he rode past early, before she was up. He did not knock. He did not leave a note. He set them on the step and rode on. She found them when she came out for water and stood for a moment looking at the tied bundle with something complicated and luminous moving across her face. She picked them up and held them and looked out at the prairie where the morning light was still fresh and pale, and she knew exactly who had left them, and the knowing settled into her chest like something warm finally arriving in a cold room. She put them in a tin pitcher on her windowsill and they were still there, a little wilted but not abandoned, 3 days later when he came to walk with her along the creek. He saw them in the window as they approached her door, and she saw him see them, and neither of them said anything about it, and the not saying was its own language, perfectly clear. August was the hardest month in Dusk Creek. The heat was serious and unrelenting, and the land went dry and pale, and tempers in the saloon ran short, and the trail drives north to Amarillo were grueling affairs that Cole managed with the steady, pressure-absorbing competence that had made him valuable to Hargrove. He was away for 12 days in August on the largest drive of the season, and Eliza did not let herself count the days, which meant she was very much counting the days. She filled them with purpose. She reopened the schoolhouse 2 weeks early for the children who were bored and underfoot, which the parents appreciated. She continued the Thursday reading circle and added a Wednesday morning session for the younger children whose mothers could bring them in. She wrote long letters to Clara in St. Louis and shorter ones to her parents, who still hoped she might come back but were beginning to understand, from the changing quality of her letters, that something had shifted. She walked the creek alone in the evenings, and she thought about Cole Whitfield with the careful, honest attention she brought to things that mattered. She thought about what she knew of him, his quietness, which was not absence but presence, his integrity, which showed not in grand gestures but in the accumulation of small, consistent choices, his humor, which was dry and rare and always earned, his hands, which were capable and gentle, his way of listening, which was complete rather than performative. She thought about the way she felt in his company, not smaller, not larger, but more precisely and comfortably herself, as if she had been slightly misaligned with her own life, until now, and his attention had been a kind of calibration. She also thought about what she did not know, which was whether he thought about her at all when they were apart, whether the tenderness she thought she detected in him was real or invented by a woman who had decided she was done being cynical about men. He came back from the Amarillo drive on a Thursday afternoon, and she did not see him until Friday morning. She was in the school garden pulling weeds from between the bean rows when she heard a horse and looked up, and there he was at the garden fence with his hat in his hands and 12 days of trail dust on him and a look on his face that answered her question comprehensively and without ambiguity. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Mr. Whitfield." She stood up and pushed her hair back from her face. "How was the drive?" "Long," he said. "Hot." "Did everything go safely?" "Mostly." "Lost 2 steers to a river crossing. None of the men." "Good," she said, and her voice had something in it that meant more than the word. "I am glad you are back." He looked at her for a moment with that steady, direct attention that always made her feel seen. "I kept thinking," he started and then stopped. "What?" she asked. He turned his hat in his hands. "I kept thinking I wanted to tell you things I was seeing. The sky over the Llano Estacado at night. The way the river looked after the crossing. There was a herd of antelope we rode through one morning just at dawn, and it was—" He stopped again. "I kept thinking you would have wanted to see it." The silence that followed this was not empty at all. It was very full. "I would have," she said softly, "very much." He nodded once, and there was a quality to the moment that both of them recognized as something arriving that had been on its way for a long time. "I will be in town for 3 weeks before the next drive," he said. "I was hoping you might walk with me this evening." "I would like that," she said. He put his hat back on and rode toward the livery, and she watched him go with her hands still full of garden dirt and a feeling in her chest that was warm and a little frightening and entirely real. They walked that evening as the sun was going down, and the sky was doing what Texas skies do in August, performing a kind of slow, extravagant theater of color that a person would be tempted to call unrealistic if they had not seen it themselves. The prairie grass caught the light and went amber, and the shadows stretched long, and the first cricket songs of the evening were starting up in the grass. They walked further from town than usual, out along the creek where the cottonwoods clustered, and the air was slightly cooler, and the world felt very large and very quiet. They talked about the drive and the antelope and the sky over the Llano Estacado, and she told him about the school and the children and the reading circle, and he listened in the thorough, attentive way he had, and she thought that there was a particular quality to being fully listened to that was one of the most intimate things one person could offer another. When they stopped at the wide bend in the creek where the water ran slow and the flat rocks made a natural resting place, and the last of the sunset was going out of the sky above them, Cole was quiet for a long moment. She waited. She had learned that his silences were purposeful, that he arrived at what he wanted to say by a route that was more internal than external. "I have never been a man for fine declarations," he said at last. "I will tell you that plainly, because it seems like the honest place to start." "I know," she said, "and I know you did not come to Dusk Creek looking for a trail boss who cannot put 3 words together without taking half an hour to find them," he said. "You are being hard on yourself," she said. "You find the right words more often than you think." He looked at her. The dark was coming on now, the warm summer dark that fell slowly on the Texas plains, and in it his face was all honest shadows, and he looked exactly like what he was, a plain, good, careful man who was standing at the edge of something. "Eliza," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name. "Cole," she said, and it was the first time she had used his. "I would like very much to court you properly," he said, "if that is something you would be willing to consider." She looked at him for a long moment. The creek moved beside them. The first stars were appearing. "Cole Whitfield," she said, "I have been walking along this creek with you every chance I get for 4 months. I think the courtship has already started." He made a sound that was very close to a laugh. "I suppose it has." "Then let us be honest about it," she said, "and see where it goes." He reached over, slowly and carefully, and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat on the flat rocks by the creek in the warm August dark with the stars coming out overhead, and it was, in its quiet and complete way, one of the most significant moments either of them had ever lived through. September brought the schoolroom back to full life, and with it the reassertion of structure and purpose that Eliza had always found grounding rather than constraining. She had her mornings with the children, her evenings with Cole when their schedules allowed, and the particular, luminous quality that belonging to a good love story gave to ordinary days. The way a cup of coffee tasted better, and a sunset looked more precisely colored, and the world had a kind of intention about it that it did not always have. They were, by the community's assessment, courting in the open and respectable fashion that Dusk Creek approved of. They walked together on Sunday afternoons and sat together at the Saturday socials and shared meals twice a week at the Hutchins table, because Mabel had been engineering dinner invitations with the determined creativity of a woman who considered their relationship her personal project, which Cole bore with patient good humor, and Eliza bore with genuine affection for Mabel's transparent and warm-hearted scheming. He brought her flowers twice more, always left on the schoolhouse step without ceremony. The first time she had pressed one of the flowers in the back of her Muir book. The second time she left the door open when she heard his horse and called out the window, "You could knock, you know." And he had stopped in the street below and looked up with that slow smile and said, "I was not sure you were awake." And she had said, "I am always awake when you ride past, which you know perfectly well." And there had been a beat of surprised, pleased silence before he laughed. He was careful with her always. He was careful in the way of a man who understood that trust was not a thing that could be accelerated or assumed, that it had to be built in the same way good things were built, patiently, honestly, one solid beam at a time. She noticed this and loved him for it, though she had not yet said the word, not even to herself in the private space of her own mind, because the word was large and serious, and she had learned the cost of saying it too quickly. They had their second real argument in October, and it was sharper than the first because they knew each other better now, and caring about someone makes their choices more consequential. It was about his contract with Hargrove. Cole had been offered a new arrangement, a 5-year commitment to manage the expanded Hargrove operation, which was growing significantly as the cattle market strengthened. The contract was financially favorable, but it committed him to a pattern of life that he had not paused to examine: long drives, extended absences, the complete subordination of personal schedule to operational demands. She did not tell him not to take it. She understood money, and she understood the limited options available to a man in his position who had no land of his own. But she asked him, quietly, over dinner at the Hutchins table after Mabel and Harold had thoughtfully found reasons to be elsewhere, whether he had thought about what he wanted his life to look like in 5 years. He was quiet for long enough that she thought she had overstepped. "I think about it more than I used to," he said at last, and he looked at his hands on the table and then at her. "I think the answer depends on things I do not yet have the right to factor in." "Such as?" she asked, and her voice was steady. He held her gaze. "Such as whether you might still be in Dust Creek in 5 years." The question was not a small one. She felt its weight settle over the table. Her teaching contract was 1 year, renewable, and she had already been asked if she intended to renew for the 2nd year, which she had said yes to without much deliberation. But 5 years was a different horizon. "I think," she said carefully, "that where I am in 5 years will depend considerably on what Dust Creek offers me." He understood exactly what she meant, and she saw him understand it, and the understanding between them was like a door opening into a very large and light-filled room. He took the Hargrove contract, but he renegotiated the drive schedule to limit the extended absences. Hargrove was not delighted about this, but Cole had something that Hargrove needed more than he could easily replace: the trust of his men, his knowledge of the range, and the particular organizational intelligence that had made the Hargrove operations cattle drives consistently profitable. He had leverage, and he used it quietly and without drama, and the result was a version of the contract that gave him more of his own time. He told Eliza about this over a walk by the creek in the early November cold, and she listened and then said, "You are good at asking for what is right." And he said, "I learned it from you mostly." And she stopped walking and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and the cold prairie air moved around them carrying the smell of dry grass and the far blue distance. "Cole," she said. "Eliza," he said. And this time when he kissed her, it was not hurried or uncertain. It was the kind of kiss that comes after months of building, intentional and honest and entirely right. The way the last piece of a well-made thing settles into place, and suddenly the whole is visible. She had her hands against his coat, and he had his hands very gently on either side of her face, and the cottonwoods rattled their last dry leaves above them, and the creek ran cold and silver beside them. And Dust Creek, Texas, on that November afternoon was the most exact and beautiful place in the world. November turned toward December, and the cold came down from the north in earnest, the kind of prairie cold that had no obstacle between it and you and knew it. The school garden went brown and dormant, and the schoolroom stove worked overtime, and Cole laid in extra wood at the schoolhouse residence without being asked, and she found it stacked by her door on a Monday morning, and stood looking at it for a moment with something in her face that she did not attempt to qualify. Christmas in Dust Creek was a modest affair by city standards, and a significant one by frontier standards. The church was hung with evergreen boughs that someone had ridden a great distance to obtain, and there were candles, and the traveling preacher came through specifically for the occasion, and gave a sermon that was long and well-intentioned and only occasionally coherent. The town gathered and ate and sang, and the children performed a nativity play that Eliza had organized, which involved 3 shepherds, one very committed wise man, and a donkey represented by a child named Henry Marsh, wearing large paper ears, who took his role very seriously. Cole sat in the third pew and watched Eliza manage the production from the side aisle, directing with small gestures and the occasional whispered correction, and she was wearing a deep green dress, and her hair was up with some small holly piece tucked into it. And he thought, with the clarity of a man who has finished being surprised by his own feelings, that he was looking at the person he wanted to spend his life alongside. After the service, they walked in the cold night together, their breath making small clouds, and the stars overhead were extraordinary in the winter dark, the whole width of the Milky Way visible from horizon to horizon, which was one of the things the empty sky of the Texas plains gave you freely. "It is beautiful here," she said, looking up. "Yes," he said, and he was looking at her. She caught his expression and laughed softly. "You are terribly obvious." "I have been called worse," he said. She took his arm, tucking her hand into the crook of his elbow, and they walked through the cold night, and the world felt perfect in its quiet, particular way. He had been thinking about what to say to her for 3 weeks, not because he was uncertain about what he felt. He had been certain of that for months, but because he wanted to say it right. He was not, by his own candid assessment, a man of beautiful speeches, and the thing he felt deserved better than an inadequate expression of it. He had thought about it on the trail and in the bunkhouse and in the quiet before sleep, and what he had arrived at was this: that the words themselves did not need to be elaborate, that she, of all the people he had known, would value honesty over ornamentation, that the most truthful expression of what he felt was also the simplest one. It was late December, a week after Christmas, and the night was very cold and very still. He and Eliza had had dinner at the Hutchins house, a proper dinner, with the kind of cheerful, affectionate company that Mabel and Harold provided, and now he was walking her back to the schoolhouse residence through the dark streets of the town. They stopped on the small porch of her door, as they always did, the closing ritual of their evenings together. The Prairie was there beyond the east edge of town, invisible in the dark but present in the way enormous things are present even when you cannot see them, in the quality of the air, the smell of cold grass and distance. She had her key in her hand, but she had not turned toward the door. "Eliza," he said. She turned to face him, and in the darkness her face was lit by the faint lamplight from the window behind her, and she looked at him with those clear green eyes that always made him feel that being understood was not as frightening as he had previously believed. He had planned to say this in better circumstances, daytime perhaps, or on the creek where they had built most of what they had together. But the night was right in a way he had not anticipated, and waiting for better circumstances was a way of losing things. He took a breath of the cold night air, and he spoke 3 words into the prairie wind that was moving around them, carrying the smell of the open country and the cold December stars. "I love you," he said. He said it quietly, the way he said most things, not declaiming, not performing, just saying a true thing in the plainest possible way. But those 3 words on his voice, in the dark, with the prairie behind them and the lamp throwing light across her face, landed with the weight of every conversation they had built together, every walk and every laugh and every honest exchange across the months since she had arrived on the stagecoach in her storm-colored dress. She was still for one long moment. The wind moved through. Somewhere far out on the prairie, a coyote called once and fell silent. He watched her face, and what he saw there was not surprise exactly, but the arrival of a thing that had been building toward arrival. "Cole," she said softly. "I know it may be," he began. "Cole," she said again, and reached up to put her hand against his face the way he had held hers in November, with that same careful, intentional tenderness. "Let me finish." He was quiet. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had been honest with her from the first conversation, who had given her wildflowers without notes and water rights without speeches, and a kiss in November cold that had been exactly as real as everything else about him. "I love you," she said. The words went out into the night air as surely as his had, and the prairie wind carried them in the same direction, and the stars burned overhead with the complete indifference to human significance that made human significance so much more moving. He pulled her close, and she came willingly, her forehead against his chest, his arms around her, and they stood like that in the cold December night, with the whole empty prairie stretching away beyond the edge of town and the lamp burning warm in her window, and neither of them spoke for a while, because speaking would have been a lesser thing than this. By morning, she had said them back. She said them again in the doorway of the schoolhouse as he left before dawn, because he had sat up with her talking by her fire until the night was nearly spent, and when he finally rose to go, she stood in the doorway wrapped in a shawl, and the winter morning was just beginning to blue at the horizon, and she said them simply, not as a statement that required a response, but as a fact she wanted to name in the daylight for the first time. He said them back, and touched her face once, and walked away into the cold morning, and she watched him go from her doorway until he was a small figure at the end of the street, and then a man on a horse moving against the pale winter sky. She went inside and stood by her window and looked out at the prairie that she had come to love almost as much as the man who had taught her to see it, and she felt the settled, particular certainty of a woman who has found the real shape of her life and recognized it. January 1879 was cold and hard, and the two of them loved each other through it with the practical, present-tense quality that the frontier demanded, and that suited them both. There was no question of grand, romantic gestures in weather that froze the water troughs overnight and kept the schoolroom stove burning from the moment she arrived at 6 in the morning until the last child left at 4 in the afternoon. Romance in Dust Creek, Texas, in January looked like a man who made sure the woodpile was never empty, and a woman who left a covered pot of soup on the bunkhouse porch on the nights he had to ride out in the cold to check on the cattle. Cole spoke to his mother, who was still living in Hill County with his older sister, by writing her a letter in early January. The letter was characteristically brief and contained within its brevity a level of feeling that his mother, who knew how to read him, understood immediately. He wrote that he had met someone, that she was a schoolteacher who had come from Missouri, that she was remarkable in the particular ways that mattered to him, honest and kind and braver than she gave herself credit for, and that she made him want to be in one place and build something that lasted. His mother wrote back within 2 weeks, "Bring her to meet us when the weather breaks and the roads are clear. And Cole, do not be slow about this. Good things do not always wait." He was not slow. On the 14th of February, which the Hutchins Almanac identified as Valentine's Day, a tradition that had been gaining popular currency in recent years, Cole Whitfield rode to the schoolhouse on his best horse, which was the buckskin he had been riding the morning Eliza first saw him from the window above the general store. He arrived at the close of the school day, when the last child had gone, and the schoolroom was empty, and Eliza was at the blackboard erasing the day's lessons. He knocked on the open door of the schoolroom, and she turned around with the chalk eraser still in her hand. He was wearing his good clothes, which she had seen only at the Saturday socials, and he was holding something that he had clearly spent some effort on, a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with actual ribbon, which in Dust Creek in February was not an insignificant acquisition. "Happy Valentine's Day," he said, with the slightly uncertain dignity of a man who is committing to a gesture he is not entirely sure of. She looked at him, chalk dust on her dress and her hair escaping its pins, and felt a rush of affection so strong and so specific. Not a general warmth, but this person, this exact person, that it was almost too much to contain in an ordinary afternoon. "Cole Whitfield," she said, "come in." He came in and gave her the package, and she opened it carefully, and inside was a small book, a natural history of the Texas plains, illustrated, which he had obtained through the general stores, ordering service at some cost and some waiting. On the inside cover, in his careful, economical handwriting, he had written, "For Eliza, who sees the world rightly." She held the book and looked up at him with something in her eyes that he had learned to recognize as the precursor to her most honest speaking. "I want to ask you something," he said, before she could speak. "Ask," she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, in that direct, plain way that was entirely his. "I do not have a ring yet. I have a plan to acquire one when we go to Hill County in the spring to meet my mother, which I would like you to do. But I did not want to wait for the ring to ask, because waiting seemed dishonest, and I have been trying to be honest with you since the first conversation." She was very still. The afternoon light came through the schoolroom windows in long, pale January bars and lay across the floor between them. "Cole," she said, "I know we have known each other less than a year," he said. "I know that is not long, but I know my own mind, Eliza. I have known it for a while, and I think you know yours." "I do," she said. "Then will you marry me?" She crossed the room to him 2 steps and took his face in her hands the way she had learned he liked, because the first time she had done it he had closed his eyes for just a moment like a man receiving something he had not known he needed, and she said very clearly, "Yes, Cole, yes." He put his arms around her, and she held the book against his back, and outside the schoolhouse, the Texas winter was still cold and indifferent and beautiful. And inside the empty classroom with its alphabet chart and its pot-bellied stove and its rows of reading books, 2 people who had found each other in the particular miracle of paying attention held each other in the afternoon light. They were married on the 15th of March, 1879, which was a Saturday and still cold, but with the first suggestion of spring in the angle of the light. The traveling preacher came through and was prevailed upon to stay for the ceremony, which he agreed to with visible pleasure, because it was a better engagement than most of what the road offered. Mabel Hutchins baked a cake of such architectural ambition that Harold had to reinforce the table that held it. The whole of Dust Creek attended, or close enough to the whole as made no difference. Eliza wore a cream-colored dress that she and Mabel had made together from fabric ordered specifically from the Amarillo dry goods catalog, and it was simple and well-fitted and exactly right for who she was. Cole wore his good suit, which he had pressed with more attention than he had previously given to any article of clothing, and he stood at the front of the church with Jim Pierce from the livery as his best man, and when she came down the aisle on Harold Hutchins's arm, a role Harold accepted with a kind of humble seriousness that made Mabel press her handkerchief to her eyes, Cole's face did a thing it rarely did publicly. It became entirely open. Every careful, private reserve that was his usual expression was simply gone, and what was there instead was the plain, complete fact of what he felt. She saw his face, and her own composure, which was considerable, wavered briefly and beautifully. The preacher read words that were old and time-proven, and they spoke their vows in the church that smelled of candles and evergreen, and Cole put a ring on her finger that his mother had sent by mail from Hill County when she heard the news. a simple silver ring with a small turquoise stone that had belonged to Cole's grandmother, and that carried its history with quiet dignity. Eliza's breath caught when she saw it, and Cole said quietly, "My mother wanted you to have it," and she looked at him with the turquoise on her finger and said, "Tell her I am honored," and meant it absolutely. They kissed, and the church made a sound that was mostly Mabel Hutchins, and the preacher beamed, and Jim Pierce led the eruption of proper masculine celebration from the back pews, and outside the March wind moved over the prairie with the first real warmth of the coming season. They spent their first night as a married couple at the schoolhouse residence, because the larger question of where they would permanently live was still being negotiated, and the residence was her home, and it was enough. Cole had been living in the Hargrove bunkhouse for 4 years and had no strong attachment to it, and Hargrove had indicated he was amenable to a revised arrangement, given that his trail boss now had a wife, which in 1879 implied a certain domestication that employers generally viewed as stabilizing. They lay in the dark listening to the prairie wind move around the small house, and she was warm against his side, and his hand was in her hair, and they talked quietly the way people do when they have been wanting to be alone together for a long time, and suddenly, extraordinarily, they are. "I cannot believe you left flowers on my step without knocking," she said at one point in a tone of affectionate retrospective indignation. "I was nervous," he said. "You nervous?" "I am frequently nervous," he said. "I am simply also quiet." She laughed and pressed her face against his chest, and he felt the laughter move through her, and it was one of the best things he had ever felt. "Cole," she said. "Eliza," he said. "We are going to be very happy," she said, and it was not a wish. It was a statement of reasonable expectation from a woman who had done the analysis. "Yes," he said, "I think we are." The spring arrived on schedule and brought everything with it. The wildflowers and the green and the swallows returning to the eaves of the schoolhouse, and the children coming back from their winter pallor with the bright, unreasonable energy of young things in warm weather. They went to Hill County in April. As planned, Cole driving the wagon and Eliza beside him on the seat with a quilt across her knees and the Texas spring countryside opening up on either side of them. And it was a 2-day journey that they made in the best possible way, talking, and sometimes being quiet, and stopping to watch a hawk work a thermal, and eating Mabel's road food from the basket she had pressed on them at departure with the focused generosity of a woman who expresses love through provisions. Cole's mother was a small, direct woman named Ruth who had weathered considerable difficulty with her dignity entirely intact, and who looked at Eliza for approximately 90 seconds upon their arrival, and then said, "Yes, I can see exactly why," which she did not explain and did not need to. Cole's sister Martha was there too, with her husband James and their 2 small children, and the house was full of the good noise of family, which Eliza had been somewhat missing without identifying it as a lack, and she settled into it with a naturalness that Ruth noticed and approved of. That evening, while Cole and James sat on the porch talking cattle and the children were being put to bed by Martha, Eliza sat with Ruth at the kitchen table and they drank tea and talked with the particular ease of 2 women who recognize in each other a similar directness and appreciate it. "He has never written me a letter about a woman before," Ruth said, "in 28 years. He told me he is not a man for words," Eliza said. Ruth smiled. "He is not. Which means the fact that he wrote is the whole story, right there." Eliza looked at the turquoise ring on her finger and then at Ruth. "I want you to know," she said, "that I understand what this ring means and I will take care of it." Ruth looked at her for a moment. "I know you will," she said. "I know my son, Miss Calloway." "Mrs. Whitfield," Eliza corrected gently, and Ruth smiled the smile of a woman who has been hoping to hear that for a long time. They went back to Dusk Creek with the warmth of family behind them and the summer ahead of them, and the question of permanent housing was resolved when Harold Hutchins, who had been holding a piece of information in reserve, revealed that the small house on the edge of town that had belonged to the late Dr. Pemberton had been sitting empty for 8 months, and that its owner, Pemberton's daughter in San Antonio, had been asking Harold to find a buyer, and would Cole and Eliza be interested? They went and looked at it on a Sunday afternoon, a proper house, not large but well built, with 4 rooms and a real parlor and a kitchen with a good range and a porch that faced west so you could see the sunsets, and a small barn out back for the horse, and eventually more animals if they wanted them. The garden had gone to weeds, but the soil was good, and Eliza walked it with the assessing eye of someone who had been making things grow all spring and saw immediately what it could be. Cole walked through the house and stood in the parlor for a moment, taking its measure. "Well," she asked from the doorway. He looked at her. "Can you see yourself here?" She looked around the room, the windows, the good light, the solidity of the walls. "I can," she said. "Can you?" "Yes," he said simply. "I can." They purchased it from Dr. Pemberton's daughter at a fair price in May, and spent the first weeks of summer making it their own, which involved considerable work and was entirely enjoyable in the specific way that building something together is enjoyable. The way the shared labor of it is itself a kind of intimacy. And the decisions, which window to put the shelf under, which corner for the reading chair, become small mutual acts of imagination. She kept her schoolteacher position, which she had no intention of giving up, and the Dust Creek School Board, which was by now firmly in her corner, renewed her contract for a 3rd year without hesitation. Cole's new arrangement with Hargrove gave him more time at home, and he began using some of it to consider the thing he had been quietly considering for some time, which was whether he might eventually accumulate enough to stake his own small operation. He talked to Eliza about this on the porch one evening in the warm gold of a July sunset, careful and honest in the way he brought her things that were not yet decided. "It would take time," he said. "Several years, probably. And the risk is real. My own small outfit going under would be different from Hargrove's going under. There is no cushion." She listened to all of it. "But you want it," she said. "I have wanted land of my own since I was 15 and we lost ours," he said. "I have just been careful about wanting things." "Be less careful about this one," she said. "We can build it together." He looked at her in the sunset light. "You are not afraid of the risk." "I came to Texas alone on a stagecoach," she said. "I have a reasonable relationship with risk." He laughed and reached over and took her hand, and they sat in the July evening while the sky went through its colors, and the first bats came out above the porch, and a mockingbird made its complex, ambitious attempt at every sound it had ever heard. The autumn of 1879 was good. The cattle market held, the school thrived, and the house on the west end of Dust Creek became, through the steady application of care and personality, a home. Eliza planted bulbs in October for the spring. Cole built a proper fence for the back garden. They hosted the reading circle some Thursday evenings because the parlor was comfortable, and Eliza's bookshelves, which were now substantial, gave the gatherings an unofficial library quality that people valued. Mabel Hutchins came every week and sat in the best chair by the fire and participated in the discussion with the fierce, well-read intelligence she kept somewhat hidden under her general warmth. And Harold came sometimes and sat quietly and listened, and the circle became one of the small institutions of Dust Creek's cultural life. Cole sat in on 2 sessions, at Eliza's invitation, and was a more attentive reader than anyone had anticipated, which Eliza had not anticipated either in her anticipation of what kind of man he was, and which she thought about with delight for several days afterward. It was in November, the 1-year anniversary of the night he had whispered 3 words into the prairie wind, that Eliza told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening when he came in from the barn with the cold night air on him and the smell of horse and hay, and she was standing by the range with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and she said, "Cole," and something in the way she said it made him go very still. She told him. He set down what he was carrying and crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands, his cold hands against her warm cheeks, and looked at her for a long moment with something moving across his face that she had never seen before, a kind of amazed, almost disbelieving tenderness, the face of a man being given something he had not known how to ask for. "Eliza," he said. "Yes," she said, answering the question he had not asked, which was whether it was real, whether she was certain, whether this was true. He kissed her forehead and then her cheek and held her carefully, as if she were already something precious in a new and specific way, and she stood in his arms in their kitchen with the range fire warm beside them, and outside the November wind moved over the prairie in the dark. "A baby," he said quietly against her hair, as if he were testing the word, letting it become real. "A baby," she confirmed. He held her, and she felt his chest move with a long breath that had something in it that she could not quite name but understood, a kind of profound arrival, the sense of a man reaching something he had been moving toward without knowing it. The pregnancy was healthy, and the community circled around Eliza with the particular warmth of small frontier places that understood that the arrival of new people was a serious and valuable thing. Mabel Hutchins became, effectively, her pregnancy advisor, cook, and general quartermaster, a role she assumed with energy and without being asked. Cole became even more attentive than he already was, which was quite attentive, and Eliza occasionally had to remind him that she was expecting a baby, not recovering from an injury, and that she could still carry things and walk distances and manage her own schoolroom. He was sheepish about this. She loved him for the instinct even as she corrected it. She taught through the winter and into the early spring with the particular combination of physical challenge and professional satisfaction that characterized the whole experience. The children were not especially concerned about her condition, being at the age where their teacher's life outside the classroom was somewhat abstract to them, and the schoolroom continued to be what it had always been, a place where things were learned and she was in charge of them. She stopped teaching at the end of March, 1 month before her confinement was expected, at the request of the school board and the insistence of Cole and Mabel combined, which was a force she was willing to yield to. The baby came on the 12th of April, 1880, which was a Tuesday afternoon with the spring sun full on the west side of the house and the prairie green and gold outside the bedroom window. The delivery was attended by Mabel, who had more practical experience than she usually advertised, and Mrs. Martinez from the south end of town, who had delivered a number of babies in her previous years, and was calm and competent in the way of someone who has seen most things. Cole was in the parlor for the duration, which was the custom of the time and which he observed with the rigid discipline of a man who has no other socially acceptable option, though Eliza could hear him pacing from the bedroom and found it deeply endearing. The baby was a boy. He was red-faced and substantial, and had from the very first moment of his life the quality of taking his circumstances seriously, which his father recognized, and his mother found immediately, overwhelmingly funny and wonderful. Cole was allowed in when it was over, and he came through the door and stopped when he saw Eliza in the bed with the rapt and furious baby against her chest, and his face did the thing it had done at the church when she walked toward him. It became entirely open, entirely without its usual careful reserve, and what was visible in it was so purely itself that Mabel, who was tidying in the corner, turned away to give them the moment and had to blink rather rapidly. Cole came and sat on the edge of the bed, and Eliza showed him his son, and he looked at the baby with the same attentive, thorough care that he brought to everything that mattered, and then very gently he put out one careful hand and touched the baby's small fist, and the baby's fingers, with the extraordinary instinctive determination of new things, closed around his father's index finger. Cole did not say anything for a moment. "He is real," he said at last, softly. "He is very real," Eliza said. "And very loud. What will we call him?" Cole asked. They had discussed names, she had a list. But looking at him now, at the small, serious, substantial person in her arms, she found she wanted to ask. "What do you think?" she said. He looked at the baby for a long moment. "James," he said. "After my grandfather, he was a good man. He deserved to be remembered." She thought about it. The baby, as if understanding the deliberation, looked up at them both with the unfocused, earnest gaze of the very new. "James," she said. "James Whitfield." She looked at Cole. "And we could call him Thomas for every day. I had a grandfather named Thomas who was also a good man." Cole nodded slowly. "James Thomas Whitfield." "Yes," she said. He leaned over and kissed her forehead and then looked at his son, and the three of them were quiet together in the April light. The years settled in around them, the way good things settle gradually and with increasing richness. Thomas, who was called Jamie by age 2, because the name Thomas had been displaced in the affectionate shorthand of family life, was a child of abundant personality who had his father's directness and his mother's gift for language and was, by general community consensus, an entertainer. Cole made progress toward his land of his own through a combination of careful savings and a fortunate development in the spring of 1881, when Hargrove decided to sell off the eastern section of his range to reduce his operation, and Cole was positioned, through years of known integrity and the support of enough people in the county, to acquire 20 acres of it at a fair price. It was not a cattle empire. It was a start, and Cole knew how to start things and build them. He brought Eliza out to see the land on the day the purchase was complete, riding together on a bright April morning with Jamie in front of Cole on the saddle, which the boy regarded as the supreme position in the world and occupied with delighted authority. They stood on the rise above the eastern creek bend, the 20 acres of grass and scrub cedar spread below them, and Cole stood quietly with his hand in Eliza's and looked at what was his. "How does it feel?" she asked. He thought about it because he always thought about it first. "Like something I have been walking toward for a long time," he said, "and like it is only the beginning." She squeezed his hand. "It is only the beginning," she confirmed. Jamie, from his position in the saddle, announced that he saw a rabbit, which he considered the most important development of the morning, and the moment opened back into the ordinary and wonderful noise of family life. By 1882, the Whitfield small ranch operation was functioning, not large but sound, with a small herd of well-chosen cattle and the systematic, intelligent management that Cole had been studying and practicing for years. He had 2 hired hands, both of whom respected him for the same reasons the Hargrove crew had respected him, and the ranch had the quality of things that are built by people who know what they are doing and care about doing it well. Eliza continued to teach. The school board, which had changed its membership twice over the years but had never changed its regard for her, had long since stopped thinking of her teaching contract as something that required renewal and simply assumed her permanent tenancy of the schoolhouse, which suited everyone. Their second child, a daughter named Ruth Eliza Whitfield, Ruth for Cole's mother, Eliza as a middle name at Cole's insistence, because he said the name was too right not to continue, arrived in the winter of 1882, healthy and fierce, with her mother's green eyes and her father's quality of unhurried deliberateness, the kind of baby who considered things before committing to an opinion. Cole was, with both his children, the kind of father that Eliza had hoped he would be, and not been certain of because certainty requires evidence, patient and engaged, and quietly involved in a way that was not the fashion for men of his time and place, but was entirely natural to him. He taught Jamie to ride at 4 and to read trail signs at 5. He sat with Ruth for long, quiet hours and read to her from whatever Eliza had been reading, which resulted in a 3-year-old who could identify several species of wildflower by sight and was extremely opinionated about which ones were prettier. Dust Creek grew. Not spectacularly, but steadily, in the way of places that are genuinely useful. A second dry goods establishment, a proper hotel to replace the boarding house, a doctor who stayed rather than passing through, a schoolhouse expansion that added a second room, and which Eliza supervised with the firm enthusiasm of someone who has been making one room do the work of 2 for 4 years. She became, over those years, One of the people that Dust Creek defined itself by a figure of institutional permanence and personal warmth. The woman who had taught most of the community's children and whose Thursday reading circle had become a genuine cultural anchor. She was known and she was valued, and she carried this with the ease of someone who has simply been themselves in public for long enough to be recognized. Cole was known differently as the man whose word meant exactly what he said it meant, whose small ranch was a model of decent management, who had negotiated the water rights settlement in the dry year of 1881, not just for the Whitfield land, but for the smaller downstream properties as well, quietly, and without making himself the hero of it. People trusted him, which was its own form of public recognition. They had been married for 5 years when Eliza sat on the west porch one September evening, while the sunset did its extraordinary thing above the Texas plains, and Cole came and sat beside her, and Jamie was in the yard catching grasshoppers, and Ruth was asleep inside, and the evening was so perfect in its ordinary completeness that it almost hurt to look at it directly. "Do you remember the first time you left flowers on my step?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "You were terrified." "Deeply," he said. She smiled. "And you left them anyway." "The alternative was worse," he said. "The alternative was not leaving them, and I could not live with that." She rested her head against his shoulder. The sun was going down behind them through the long September light. Jamie caught his grasshopper and announced the fact loudly and released it immediately, which was consistent with who he was, deeply interested in catching things, broadly indifferent to having them. "I would have noticed if you hadn't left them," she said. "I would have noticed the absence." "Would you, Cole?" She sat up and looked at him with the direct, clear-eyed look that was one of the things he had loved first about her. "I noticed you from my window the morning after I arrived, before we had spoken a single word." He looked at her. "You never told me that." "I am telling you now," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What did you notice?" She thought about it, the figure crossing the dusty main street with a buckskin horse, the particular way he moved, the quality of presence that had made her pause with her hairbrush halfway through her hair. "That you were entirely yourself," she said. "That there was nothing performed about you, even from a distance." He looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had come to Dust Creek in a storm-colored dress with a leather trunk, and a determination that had always been bigger than the circumstances that had preceded her. "Eliza," he said. "Cole," she said. "I love you," he said, because it was still the truest thing he knew how to say, and he said it whenever it was true, which was always, but he said it deliberately and not reflexively, the way he did most things. "I love you," she said back. The prairie wind moved over them. The last of the sunset bled into dark. Jamie came up the porch steps with dirty knees, and a story about the grasshopper that involved considerably more drama than the actual events warranted, and Cole listened to it with full attention, and Eliza got up to check on Ruth, and the evening became what evenings in that house always became, warmly, contentedly, specifically alive. In later years, when Ruth was old enough to ask about how her parents had met, Eliza told her the story in the way it had actually happened, the stagecoach and the boardwalk and the creek and the Saturday social and the November kiss and the December night on the porch with the prairie wind moving around them and 3 words spoken into it. "And then what?" Ruth asked, with the practiced interest of a child who knows the good part is coming. "And then by morning I had said them back," Eliza said. "What words?" Ruth asked, though she knew. "I love you," Eliza said. "The oldest words there are, the ones that are always new." Ruth considered this with the grave, deliberate thoughtfulness she had inherited from her father. "And then you got married." "And then we got married," Eliza confirmed. "And had me," Ruth said. "And had you," Eliza said. "And Jamie." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Was father nervous?" she asked. "When he said the words?" Eliza smiled, remembering the cold December night and the porch and the lamplight on his face and the enormous, patient prairie behind them both. "He was the calmest I had ever seen him," she said, which was how I knew he had already decided. Ruth nodded, satisfied with this. Cole, who had been standing in the parlor doorway for approximately the last 2 minutes listening, came and sat in the chair beside Eliza's, and Ruth climbed into his lap with the casual authority of a child who has never had reason to doubt her welcome. And the September evening came in through the open windows of the house that had been built into a home. And outside, the Texas sky was beginning its first stars, and the prairie was going quiet in the way it did in the evenings, gathering itself, breathing. Enormous and alive, and indifferent to human smallness, in a way that made human warmth so much more precious by contrast. Cole put his arm around Eliza's chair, not around her shoulders but behind her, the familiar gesture of 5 years of marriage that said simply, "I am here," without requiring the words. She leaned back slightly into it. "Tell it again," Ruth said, to neither of them in particular, meaning the story. "Tomorrow," Eliza said. "Tomorrow," Cole agreed. And the house held them, all of them. The trail boss with his careful words and his honest hands, the schoolteacher with her clear green eyes and her prairie window and her uncontained heart, the boy who caught grasshoppers and released them, the girl who could name wildflowers by sight, held them in the warm evening in the town they had become part of, under the enormous sky that asked nothing of them and gave them everything, in the life that had been built not from fortune or design but from attention and honesty. And 3 words whispered into the prairie wind that came back in the morning, like something the land itself had answered.